and we already have one question from Onosinke, if I'm pronouncing the name right. Ono says, many thanks for the brilliant talk. May I please have a question for Dr. Chi? If the grouping method of various Japanese versions of JPM by periodization would have a tendency of being subjective and overly generalized, if so, how might you suggest to further minimize it?
Okay. Well, thanks for the question. It's certainly a very interesting one. And I mean, some element of the question have been discussed a lot, for example, about subjectivity or objectivity of research, particularly in translation research, because we are interpreting translation activities and the phenomena. Total objectivity is impossible, and that's widely acknowledged. So there's certainly always that level of subjectivity in our research, in our interpretation. And that's also why people, some people, such as Gideon Turi, warned that we should be very cautious when we are using paratexts, particularly, for example, the interviews with the translators. What they said about their translation, they could not be taken at face value, of course. And therefore, one way to, I guess, not to avoid, but as you said, to minimize, I think that's a really good word and very accurate to describe what we are doing, to minimize the overgeneralization or the subjectivity is to complement our interpretation with these other researchers' findings, and also complement the general descriptions with more specific case studies. For example, within one historical period of time, there can be a general trend, but then within the general trend, there's always exceptions. And these exceptions could also be researched later on so that the two can actually complement each other and hopefully also try to enrich the area of study and minimize the risk of generalization. And as we understand, socio-cultural contexts are constantly changing, and it's not static. It's definitely always dynamic, and change never happens overnight. Therefore, when we are examining one text, we have to consider not only its synchronic context, but also put it in a more broader historical context, to consider its prior context and immediately after the socio-cultural contexts. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question and for the answer. I have another question from the audience. Thanks, that was very inspiring, says Audrey. Early in the talk, you said that there were no translations into Japanese in the Edo period because JPM's language is so complex. Do you think there were also other reasons?
Right, yeah. Okay, well, this is another difficult question, and I'm sure there is no easy answer because the question itself has actually been discussed by various scholars. For example, the one I quoted in my presentation, it's actually, well, before her, the common belief was that because of the pornographic reputation of Jinping Mei, it was not translated, and people are not, for example, not, I would not say not interested, but people would try to avoid it, do not want to connect their name with a pornographic novel. But then in the last few decades, there are some new research. They actually found that Jinping Mei was very popularly read and circulated among the intellectuals of the time. And as I said, there's reading clubs, they talk about the book and try to make sense of the language and the cultural issues in the book. And some even use it to learn about Chinese language and culture. But I guess the conclusion about the language being so difficult and therefore translation did not exist was actually resulted from the reading club, the annotations made by the reading clubs. In their annotations, they actually singled out a lot of linguistic expressions and cultural elements and attempted to make explanations. But a lot of these explanations are incorrect, and a lot more actually have the note not clear or does not understand. And therefore, the researchers came to the conclusion that because the language is too difficult and nobody actually is capable of translating it by themselves. I'm sure there will be other perhaps practical reasons, but as I said, my research into the Japanese translation of Jinping Mei has only just started, and I probably will continue looking into these areas. But thank you very much. That's a very inspiring question.
Thank you. So we've already started with the questions. As I said, this was a really inspiring talk, very interesting. You can, so the audience can ask questions both in the chat box, as we did so far, and then I will read the questions aloud, and but you can also unmute yourself or raise your hand if you want to ask your question in person. So you can also ask your question by unmuting yourself or using your camera. So any way you like, and we are open for any additional questions from the audience. While the audience is thinking, maybe I can just quickly use this opportunity and to ask my question, and I'll go back to the general layout of this book and ask Dr. Tobias about because it's a really interesting and unusual, I would say, layout to include both theoretical texts and reflections from practicing translators. So I wanted to know how this two, and you did explain a little bit why these two parts, or why this approach in your book. But I wanted to ask, what are your general kind of conclusions, or do you think, or what are the things that you can identify on the intersection of theory and practice, or how does theory inform practice, and vice versa?
Sure, I can respond to that. I think it's a great point about the intersection between theory and practice. And if you read the book, I think that one of the key themes that does emerge from both parts of the book is that close integration between the research and the translation practice. You know, it's very clear from reading the case studies that a translator can't even attempt to try and translate a classical Chinese text without, you know, very close and intimate knowledge of the historical, the cultural context. And this knowledge can really only be gained through this very close, meticulous process of research. You know, they go into quite a lot of detail about the process and how this process allows them to form an interpretation of the source text, and then they have to consider how to convey this interpretation to the target audience. And when they're doing this, you can see from their reflections that in effect they are actually theorizing, whether consciously or not. Through their methods and approaching the task, through their process, through their decisions that are embodied in their translation, these really, you can see that these represent their theoretical perspective on their task, on the art of translation. So I think that they are, completely interwoven, and you can also see reading their contributions that the translators themselves are quite self-aware about this, and their reflections, their meta commentary is really interesting, not only giving us insights into how they went about translating the particular text and the particular issues they encountered, but also from like a broader theoretical perspective. You can see their thought processes, illuminating their translation decisions. So I see the two parts as very much interwoven in that respect.
Thank you, Shani. It will be really interesting to see, especially if there's a corresponding text, how it's theorized by scholars, and then what are the actual things brought forth by practicing translators. I have another question, if we don't have any questions from the audience at the moment. Just have another question, maybe for Dr. Chi. You did mention, or Shani mentioned, that one of the main aspects of this book, of this volume, it's its diversity, and it does cover quite a significant and diverse geographically and in terms of languages. However, I couldn't help but notice that there's also gaps, in terms of translation into, let's say, Latin American or within the African region, and the languages present there. So can you tell us a little bit about what does this reflect? Does it say that there's no translations in these regions of classical Chinese literature?
Well, I guess the answer is no, it's not a reflection of lack of translation in these areas or languages. It's more reflection of, I guess, more from a practical perspective. It will be a reflection of the network we are having, and of course the horizon we have in research, and the interaction we have with the fellow researchers from the other parts of the world. So it does reflect that limitation practically. But I guess when we are highlighting the diversity, we are also trying to say it's a first step of moving from the Eurocentric or the focus from the Anglophone context. So we are broadening the context to cover other languages, such as Danish and Czech and Japanese. But it's far from enough. For example, we don't have anything on the Korean translation of Chinese classics or translation into Vietnamese. Even within the area of Asia, there is still a lot more to do. And within Europe, of course, there are other languages we hoped to cover as well. But the thing is, in the process of editing a book, things do not always materialize. So, for example, we did have a contributor from the Spanish language, and we also tried to cover at least one Portuguese case study, but this eventually did not, actually eventuate. Therefore, we would say this is a very first step towards that diversity, and we are certainly advocate that diversity. We believe that diversity will be, as Shani said earlier, be mutually beneficial to all the contributors participating in the volume, by contributing their different perspectives, different theories, different methodological approaches. But there are a lot more to do, and we have just started the journey, I guess.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it will be interesting to see, you know, new maybe follow-ups with new and different translations. I think we have another question. Zhang Wu says, thank you for this interesting and inspiring talk. When producing Jinping Mei English texts, do you consider cultural content? For example, sociocultural? If you do, in what way?
Right, okay, the cultural content. Right, okay. Do you mean the translation of the cultural elements of the Chinese source text into English, or just the research on the English translations in the sociocultural contexts of the Anglophone world? All right, okay.
I think we have an answer.
Translation. Yep, okay, the translation of the cultural elements. Yes, of course, I think, well, in my research, previously did one master thesis on the English translation of Jinping Mei, which covers some of the linguistic issues, some of the cultural issues. But in my current research, I'm on mainly focusing on the sociocultural context of the target context. But of course, even if you are examining the translation of the cultural elements of the Chinese source text into a target language, you still need to situate within the target context. Therefore, well, yes, I do have an interest in these areas, and my research in the past has examined these areas, but mainly from the intersection between, I guess, the source text and the translator's habitus and capital. So in the past, it's from this angle. It's still largely into the category of sociological translation studies. So why a particular translator translate this cultural expression in a certain way? And that's what I did in the past. But if I'm doing that right now, I'll also take into consideration the more broader sociocultural context. For example, I would say if we are looking at the sexual culture, you would certainly need to consider the literary censorship in the target context. Without that, any research would not be complete. Sorry, that's a very brief answer. I guess there will be a lot more to that question, but I'm happy to discuss further after the talk.
Great, thanks. And another question directed to you, Rick. You know, the presentation of the chapter, I guess, is stimulating a lot of interest. So Wong Yu Yam says, many thanks for the interesting talk. You mentioned that censorships imposed on literature during Meiji period to pre-war period. Some words are hidden or prevented to be included in the works. This may affect the way in translating and researching on works in that period of the time. Do you think that it's possible to do transdisciplinary research between arts and culture?
Well, yes, and as a matter of fact, what I would hope to happen within the edited volume, and as Shani also mentioned earlier, is that conversation between disciplines. So superficially, it's a conversation between different researchers, but as a matter of fact, this will be actually interaction between different disciplines. Any translated text can be approached from different perspectives and can be examined by researchers of different disciplinary backgrounds. Therefore, in terms of Jinping Mei, of course, there are already researchers on Jinping Mei coming from Chinese studies, from literary studies, from translation studies, and from anthropology, from historical studies. So there is nothing to stop you or stop us approaching the same text from multiple perspectives. And by collaborating with each other, we could actually combine all these perspectives into one piece of research, which will, I'm sure, will become more fruitful and more insightful.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Rick. Shani mentioned that we have in the audience one of the contributors to this volume. So at this point, I would like to invite any of the contributors, if they want to say a few words about the book or their chapter or anything really. If you want to just share briefly your views, you're welcome to do so.
Yeah, Sophie?
Yes, thank you, Maria. Thank you so much for the invitation. Perhaps I couldn't speak because I couldn't show my face because right now I'm in a quarantine hotel. I just went back to Taiwan, and the connection here is really slow, so I couldn't turn on the camera, but I could only speak a few words. First of all, I really appreciate Rick and Shani's invitation to include my article into this volume. I really think this edited volume is so valuable. So you can see in the very beginning, you can see from Shani's introduction, it actually includes so many prestigious scholars from different disciplines. And what is more important is that you can see this is really a dialogue between the disciplines, especially it includes a dialogues between translation studies and cultural studies. So I think this is really valuable. And from my article, in the very first place, I thought, because this is an article which includes the translation history, especially from Jesuit missionaries translation, and how they position themselves in this translation of Chinese classics. In the first place, I might thought that maybe my article would be a little bit different, or maybe far from this area. But after Shani's introduction, and I can see that actually it includes so many scholars, and my article can still make a small contribution to this edited volume. So thank you so much. Yes. So I think this is what I can share. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. I don't see any additional questions, so we can there's no really, we can extend for a couple of more minutes if you have any additional questions or any final questions. And if there's I just want then maybe to ask one final question before we end this this sharing, and that will be directed to both of you, I guess, Rick or Shani. So if you can tell us what is the maybe one main thing that you could point to as a conclusion from this volume, and if you can tell us a little bit about, do you have any future plans, or what will be your recommendation for any future research in this area?
All right, okay, I'll start, and maybe Shani can say a bit more afterwards. So I guess the most significant lesson we've learned, or the message that I hoped to convey from editing this volume, is that further interaction and conversation between scholars from different disciplines are actually desperately needed. As we can see from this volume, there are researchers from a wide range of areas doing closely related research, but there were not much interactions between them. And that's also why when we said about diversity, we are actually respecting different researchers' choice of theory, of their research methods, and of the way they present their chapters. As you can see, some chapters are more theoretical than the other. Some actually follow a different academic convention, not only in terms of referencing, but also in terms of the way the articles were structured. So these are all part of the I guess the narrative about diversity. But there is also a clear message from that differences and diversity, is that more interaction and more collaboration between people from different parts of the world working on the same broader area of research. So particularly, I guess, between researchers from mainland China and from the rest of the world, and from those working in English language and from the non-Anglophone context. These are especially important and will be actually especially fruitful. And on that note, my next step, I'm currently actually co-editing a volume on Jinping research. So the translation and dissemination of Jinping around the world, not just into English, not just into Japanese, but into various languages, major and minor languages around the world. It will be published towards the end of the year.
Well, that's great to hear. We do look forward to a new book, Rick. Well, that's might be more or less the end of our sharing today. With we are a bit over time. We kind of planned 1 hour, but it seems that the discussion was very interesting and we had a lot of questions. So I hope everyone's happy that we extended for a few more minutes. And if there's no final questions, then I think we can close this book talk today here. I want to thank again all of you for being with us for the 4th Hong Kong Baptist University Department of Translation and Interpreting and Intercultural Studies book talk. Special thanks to Dr. Chi and Dr. Tobias for sharing their thoughts on their very interesting, very timely edited volume. And just to remind everyone that this book talk series, organized by TIIS department at Hong Kong Baptist University, is a quarterly series. So we do hope to present to you new research in translation studies, but also other disciplines that do combine or with translation studies and intercultural studies. Hopefully our next book talk will be happening in September. So you will hear from us very soon with the topic of our next talk. And I hope to see all of you again in September for our next discussion. Thank you everyone for your time and hope to see you soon. Bye.